Hi, everyone. Welcome to Hope and Healing Chats. I will be your host, Monifa Alice Addy, and I've been working in this field for several years dealing with individuals and couples. Today's topic, we're going to talk about the truth about sex addiction. But first, make sure you like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. To help us dive into this topic, we have a friend to the show. He's a clinical director of Banyan Therapy Group, and he's written many books in this field dealing with healing and treatment in this subject of sex addiction. Introducing Dan Drake.
Hey, Monifa. Good to join you.
Well, welcome back.
Happy to
So,
be here.
something that I find that comes up often in treatment is like in the first session, I find myself talking a lot about how sex addiction is not about sex. And I find myself talking about that with partners and with sex addicts because everyone comes in with, I mean, it's called sex addiction. So everyone comes in with that focus of sex, but then at its core, it's not about sex. Does that come up for you often when you come up in your sessions? Do you find yourself talking about that?
Yeah, for sure. Which actually is a little surprising. I think probably anyone listening would say, "What? That doesn't make any sense."
What is it about? Yeah.
If you're a sex addict, aren't you addicted to sex, and isn't it about sex? So,
Yeah.
and I think that actually, you're right. I think a lot of and early on, especially the sex addicts, actually think it's all about sex too. They don't realize that there's more going on, and of course, the betrayed partner. What injured the relationship and injured them was sexual betrayal. So of course it's about sex. Sex is the problem. But yeah, of
Or
course it's yeah.
because then they'll think I have a high sex drive, so that's the issue. Or the partner's trying to address sex here because then that's the issue. And then we peel it back because I always like to use something I learned from you actually, the idea of the iceberg, where you have the sex addiction is kind of like the symptom of the stuff that's underneath the iceberg that we don't even see. So, in regards to this conversation, it all kind of goes back to trauma.
Hmm. Yeah.
What is there a trend? Actually, let's explain that more when we say that goes back to trauma. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is something interesting. I mean, when we in our field we talk about sex addiction as a intimacy disorder. So what does that even mean? I
Uh
mean,
huh.
where usually kind of where I start is early on, going back to trauma. So let's say a lot of our clients actually don't even think that they have trauma. They
Yeah.
don't realize it, or they don't realize kind of the impact of their past on them. Oftentimes, because not only did they experience some form of trauma, they also probably didn't get support to deal with that trauma. So they learn it wasn't that big of a deal, and they kind of learn to suppress whatever the wounds were. Um, and that could be physical abuse, sexual abuse. Sometimes also the impact. This is a tricky one. The impact of physical neglect, or especially emotional neglect. Emotional neglect. It's hard to pinpoint what those wounds are, but those are pretty
Mhm.
powerful. So if I have those things early on, experience those things really early on in my history, oftentimes before people can turn to substances, drugs, alcohol, they what do I have available to me? Usually I have food or I have my body. So either I maybe I learn to touch my genitals and I feel a little bit of relief during, let's say I'm hearing alcoholic father hitting my mother or something, and it's really really scary. It's threatening. I want to hide, but I can't. So I find that one form of self soothing that just makes me feel a little bit more relief during a really terrifying situation. That's not sex addiction, obviously. It's just a form. But I've paired what in that moment. I've paired this fear, this real threat, with a bit of self soothing with my body. That can start the seed of something where I'm coping. It's basically a coping strategy I'm using to manage life and threats and stress, which over time, especially when someone gets to adolescence, then now their sexuality is awakened. If it wasn't awakened prematurely from sexual abuse, then it really becomes awakened, and they kind of snowball with some of this that they instead of learning other coping strategies, they keep using that same one. That's what I
Which
see. I'm
then,
curious. Yeah.
yeah, which then, of course, connects to if we're talking about intimacy disorders, because especially in a time of fear, you would prefer, of course, for the child to lean into their parent and have that intimate connection. But then when that's not safe, and you're like, okay, all I have to do is I can only depend on myself, so I can cope with it the way that I know how to. now we have the seeds of addiction for when they get older.
Right. That's the because now I've learned my I've got to take care of myself, my own
Mhm.
needs. I have to take care of my own needs. That nobody else is going to take care of them for me. So either I rely on myself and I kind of shut people out, which is the start of like an avoidant attachment. Someone I'm
Yeah.
going to protect myself, or maybe I overly um, go towards somebody else and like it maybe not. I don't really know what true intimacy is and true connection is, and I'm just trying to get something from some soothing from another person potentially that's not actually real connection because it wasn't modeled for me growing up.
Um, and backtracking a little bit when you were saying how a lot of our clients don't realize that there was any trauma, I think it's also important to point out, there's, even though I don't really like this phrase of big T and little t trauma, just because at the end of the day, trauma is trauma. Like it's going to affect you how it affects you. But many times there'll be the little t traumas, which aren't, I don't know, death of a family member as a child or sexual abuse, like the little t ones, which is, I think, emotional abuse and things that kind of just go under our nose because you're just surviving and that's life. So you don't realize that you're being emotionally cut off and coping through these ways. So therefore, when they get older, that's just been your way of life. So it doesn't even register that there was any sort of trauma or anything that affected them in any way.
Mm-hmm. Especially if that part is it's threatening. I didn't have a place to go to for whatever the wound is, whether it's emotional or physical or sexual. That I don't have a place I can go to. So to protect myself, I'm going to kind of lock that part away because if I fully admit this was a big deal and there's nobody there to kind of process it with me, that's really threatening. That's actually pretty dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
So the safest thing, it wasn't that big of a deal. I'm going to move on with my life. I'm not going to depend on other people and I'll be okay. So that's oftentimes where we get people in our offices for sure.
Can you talk a little bit about like what's happening on like a physiological level when trauma happens?
Yeah, that's a big question. A lot of stuff actually. There's a lot. If we have, this is polyvagal, so kind of
Yeah.
condensing
Mhm.
it a bit. But
Yeah.
if we have different systems, right? There's the system towards protect ourselves, and there's also this social engagement system. Um, if I'm in trauma, a lot of times these are relational wounds we're talking about. So natural disasters, these things happen. Um, that's different than if it's my primary caregiver that's harming me or loved ones. There's something about it that I think threatens our nervous system. So our nervous system goes into fight or flight or shut down sometimes with more a dorsal response to these things. And then also when we're there, we're not able to really engage socially. So we kind of shut that part down. Um, where we get people later is that they've never really learned how to process stuff in
Mhm.
a safe way, and I think that's kind of in their own system physiologically they're not really able to handle or manage pain, stress, trauma, and then engage with other people, like turn to other people in a safe way. So I think, again, I think that's where we can talk about part of the intimacy disorder really really plays out. um,
Yeah. Which kind of connects to many times I'll see people where they have the sobriety piece in order, but they're not dealing with the relational portion of it, which is where the trauma, is kind of festered in. That's the part where the trauma is actually affecting you the most. So is it possible to be in recovery of sex addiction and then but not be dealing with the relational piece, meaning going to meetings, having acted out, checking all the boxes basically.
like
Like
effective, so is this effective recovery, like long term sobriety? What are we talking?
well, because lots of times I guess in their minds they might think that this is effective recovery. Like I am checking off all the boxes and then I have to be like, well, there's a whole nother, which actually leads to another episode that we'll be filming, but which is relational recovery versus sobriety. A lot of people don't understand that once again, sex addiction is just the tip of the iceberg. So even if we're checking off all those boxes, it's kind of like a dry drunk
Hmm.
where they haven't really dealt with anything. They're still might be gaslighting people, being emotionally abusive, lying, but they're not doing the thing. Or many times I'll see it transfers. So now I'm no longer acting out, not masturbating, but now I'm eating junk food constantly, or spending, or video games, or whatever.
Yeah, there's a there's kind of a joke. How do you spot an AA meeting, an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting,
Hmm.
by all the smokers standing outside?
Yeah.
You know, and it looks different. I think for sex addiction, you're not going to find. So I think when you're right, there, people often trade. So if my primary way that I was coping with life was through sexuality, and that I'm suppressing that or I'm stopping those behaviors, we oftentimes with sex addiction, with sex addict, will find they'll either throw themselves into money and work, so they'll kind of that might go up, so they'll go to another process oftentimes, so it'll be money or work, sometimes food, sometimes on the flip side hyper working out or exercise, but more
Hmm.
often than not they'll kind of binge with food. So you'll see people kind of gain weight or fluctuate with their weight when they're in recovery, which is a whole other topic, kind of what you're saying. The addict may say, "Hey, I've stopped my behaviors. Everything's good." Their betrayed partner is like, "You still feel pretty addicty because you just gained 20
Hmm.
pounds. You don't seem that healthy." Like there's all this kind of stuff that doesn't feel like they've actually done the work to kind of get underneath what the behaviors came from. So I mean, that's a whole other conversation. But I
Hmm.
to your point earlier, can someone get sobriety without dealing with the relational piece or dealing with trauma? Yes, I do think some can't, some can. Sobriety, though, that's just stopping a behavior. Sobriety is not,
Exactly.
to me, recovery. Recovery is a lifestyle. It's living life in a new way. It's handling relationships. It's dealing with underlying wounding, and then also rebuilding and restoring relationships, and turning like actually turning towards people for connection as opposed to isolation. Most addicts isolate. So how do I turn towards human beings to actually rebuild and connect, as well as my betrayed partner, rebuild and restore that relationship? So I think there's another layer. It's not just the relational piece, which I guess is connected to trauma, but there's also, I've seen a number of people that have been able to get sobriety through 12 step. They've done some really, really good, solid work going to 12 step meetings, or, SAA or other types of 12 step meetings. But then, and they're doing pretty well, but then something happened, life stressors hit, like major something major happens in their life, and they just didn't really deal with the underlying stuff that kind of got
Hmm.
them there in the first place. So I've had some people actually end up with, that had long-term sobriety, that never really did the deeper trauma work, that end up relapsing even later on because they never really dealt with what was underlying
Yeah.
the addiction in the first place, which would have been some of those early trauma or wounding, which does have an impact on the relationship when they address it. So I've definitely seen that happen, and it's really confusing because some people have done some really good recovery work. They've just missed some of the pieces of it.
Yeah. Do you see any trends? Like if we're talking about, I don't want to call it causation, but I guess popular traumas, for lack of better word,
Like that lead to sex addiction.
that lead to sex addiction
Oh man,
or involved in sex addiction.
it's hard to say because I don't know what you'd say. I remember when I was did my training to be a sex addiction therapist, whenever that was. This was still pretty early on with technology. We didn't have smartphones the way we have them today. Like they just weren't. It wasn't quite the same as technology. So there was Patrick Carnes, who's the kind of founder of all of the sex addiction field. He did some research, and he had some pretty clear. These are the things that lead to sex addiction. He identified, I think, 70+% of addicts had sexual abuse in their history. I want to say 80 something percent physical abuse, and then 97% emotional abuse led to this. That's pretty general. Like what does that mean, and what kinds of abuse are we talking about? But I think that's all shifted a bit with technology these days. That some people may not have, though it may look different because of how we can get um, pulled into addictive behaviors. Like the internet's addictive in and of itself, gaming's addictive in and of itself, smartphones are addictive in and of themselves. So I think we also find it's hard, I guess it's hard to know because I don't know that we really know even, let's say, this generation that's been raised completely on smartphones and tech that we have today, what does that look like, and are we seeing it the same way? I don't know. I just know what it was in the past, in the, let's say,
Yeah.
90s and early 2000s, but I'm not quite sure these days. So what's are the trend? I'm curious. I don't know if you're seeing anything
Well,
specific, but
you actually brought up something else that I think is important to point out because now in treatment, they have to divide the contemporary addict versus the classic addict. And I feel like that's the reason for that because of social media, phones, all those things are addictive in itself. The treatment with that kind of addict is going to look different than the classic addict where we're talking about trauma wounds from childhood because it might not necessarily, it's not the same connection. So there's a difference of treatment. So in those situations, if we're talking about just devices and such being addictive, they might have, an emotionally present family that's actually doting over them and supportive and all those things. But just because the device in itself being addictive, that's where their attention turns to, which intimately disconnects them from family. So it's not necessarily so much of a coping thing. It's more of, um, I guess, just dopamine hits in itself.
mhm.
Whereas with trauma, it's more of a coping thing. So it does differentiate. But in regards to trauma, as you were going over the different percentages, in my head, I was thinking, oh, because I feel like emotional abuse and neglect is probably number one, just because it's so covert
Mhm.
and you can't necessarily put your finger on it, and it has to take some digging to even get to it. I feel like that is the one that comes up the most often if we're not talking about devices.
Yeah, I that makes sense. That's what I see too, for sure.
No. And I feel like there's a difference in the clientele also. If we're talking about devices and such, the clientele gets a little bit younger
Hmm.
on the younger side because they kind of catch it earlier or they know that it's being addictive. Whereas when we're talking about trauma, because unbeknownst to them, they're usually coming in when it's a problem. Like there's been discovery, fired from work, like something has happened and they're older that now they
Hmm.
have to come in and get treatment for it.
Right.
Um, what was I going to say? Oh, so how does someone, with all this information now that we're giving them, how do they go about treatment? Like if they're like, okay, this is not about sex addiction, this is about trauma, what does that mean for them?
I do think there's, well, it's a both and. I do think there is, as a CSAT, there are
Hmm.
pieces of understanding, really clearly understanding nuances of sex addiction and how it shows up, or betrayal trauma, how this shows up in relationships. So I do think there's some pieces of building relapse prevention and strategies to help someone manage with the addiction. So I think having someone who's specialized is really important, who understands sex addiction, and also if the person is partnered, what betrayal trauma and the impacts are of betrayal trauma for the relationship. Because just I don't know about you, I was not trained in this in school at all.
Oh, God,
Not
no.
one class. I had an addictions class that was like a 2 unit class,
Hmm.
and I don't even. We might have
I don't
talked about
remember it.
gambling. I don't think
Yeah,
sex came up at all.
no.
So maybe it's addressed more, but that means people in graduate school, there might be therapists out there that say they know what about sex addiction, but they might not have. Most of, if not everything I've learned has been post all my training. It's been actually, getting specialized experience and training in this field. So I think getting a specialist is really important. That said, having someone that can get to the underlying wounding underneath, there's different ways to do that. Um, I've been trained in EMDR, which I think is really effective. It's not effective for everybody, though. Some people really, so it's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing is what that stands for. And it's a kind of brain based way to help heal some of the wounding from the past. There's other things like that are offshoots like brain spotting that are really, people have found really effective. The other general way I found, if people don't respond so well to EMDR or brain spotting, more somatic work, I found like the somatic type therapies, sensory motor or somatic experiencing or those kinds of things I think are really helpful. They're more in the theory with those is that a lot of the traumas get stored in our body.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a way of kind of unfreezing the stuff that we weren't able to express, so that we can actually kind of move through those traumas, so that they don't kind of continue having a hold on us moving forward. So those are a couple main. There's a lot of different other nuances. I'm even finding too. There's more research, which is actually kind of exciting, about use of other plant-based medicines. So
Mm-hmm.
could it be psychedelics
Okay.
and MDMA or ketamine? People are finding some
Mm-hmm.
really good benefit from, that are actually helping not just our brains lower the intensity of our traumatic experiences, but actually kind of rewiring the brain in new ways. Those
Yeah.
are still they're still more, I guess, experimental at this point, but I think there's some really exciting possibilities with them.
Yeah. No, a few of my clients have tried it and came back with pretty good results. Um, and you mentioned in EMDR that it's not, suitable for everyone. What is the kind of client that EMDR would be suitable for?
It's hard to know. It's hard to
Okay.
know. Sometimes it's try it and see how. Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard for me to know for sure who's going to respond and who's not. Mm, yeah, again, I wish I could say exactly what would, if there's a set kind of type
Yeah.
person that would work for, because
So
it's
then
basically
basically,
the goal is to um, lower the intensity of our reactivity to certain traumas. So it's kind of processing through them, because like when we have a traumatic experience, those things understandably create these huge memories and neural networks that are attached to, let's say I have a major trauma. A lot of stuff happens. Maybe there's a clear before, a date before and an after this trauma experience happened. um, we're trying to lower some of the intensity, so that it's not taking over someone's life, where that particular traumatic experience is so devastating. Of course, they're going to have the impact of it, but that hopefully over time it lowers the intensity of it, so that it's not um, running there every day.
yeah. So, I mean, basically, well, and I go about it a little differently because I'm not trained in EMDR or those practices. But I notice lots of times that sex addicts, there's all these cognitive distortions and then negative core beliefs, and the negative core beliefs are like the engine that's pushing everything. So I always like to try to work from that angle, like, because many times these core beliefs were put into them, or all of us actually, at a young age before we had any say in it, and our brains are still forming. So we take these things on as their law when that's not the case. Um, an example of that would be if someone says, I'm not worthy of love, and then we transfer it back to parents, neglectful, whatever the case may be. If I rephrase that in a way of capacity, so I'm not talking about worth, then it's, your parents didn't necessarily have the capacity to show up for you in the way that they needed to, which then in turn minimized your capacity for yourself. So then you end up showing up in the world that way of being less than. Those kinds of things, it's like, okay, so what was actually happening during that time? Like taking yourself out and trying to look at it more from like, I guess, which is a bit more narrative therapy ish, where we're kind of rewriting the story
Hmm.
into something more realistic. I find that to be very effective
Hmm.
with clients because now they're going forward with something like, oh, it's not me, especially your child. Like you don't have any influence on anything.
Right.
Like this was a more like realistic way of what was happening. Um,
But in that case, a child doesn't know. I mean, when we're a child,
exactly.
our whole world is so, we don't. Our parents aren't. Until for a while, our parents aren't real people. They're all related
Mhm.
to us. So of course, we're very focused internally. We don't have that perspective that an adult would have. Yeah.
Exactly. So as an adult trying to take them from the egocentric version of a child and taking them into the adult thinking of now we can look at the whole perspective. Because in trauma, it is pretty much like you're stuck in that child version of yourself, which now you're coping with the world in the same way because but now you have so many more options. You don't have to cope in that way. Um, I think I find that more when we're doing the circle plan, which treatment plan. So you have the inner circle, the behaviors you want to abstain from, then all your triggers in the middle, and then your healthy behaviors on the outer. When we get to the outer circle, everyone struggles with that because they've been so used to coping with the things from that they want to abstain from in the inner circle
Right.
that they don't even realize that they have these options of things because you're an adult now. You don't have to operate where, like you said earlier, you only have it's usually your body and food. that you can cope with. Those are your only options. Now you have a whole plethora of options. So, but sometimes in order to get them to access that, we got to do the core belief work and reframe that so that way it kind of opens up their mind to like, so kind of healing the inner child to go
Mhm.
into the adult work.
Which, speaking of which, there is a whole series. Eddie Caparucci has a whole series of, it's called Going Deeper, and it's for sex addicts really getting in touch with their inner children. So the different parts of them that are active and wounded, and how they can kind of heal those wounds so that they don't engage in their behaviors in the same way. So I think I found that really helpful for some people. Also, what's another modality that's really popular right now is internal family systems. A lot of people know
Yeah.
about it, have heard about it these days. So, and it's basically looking at, all of us have different parts of ourselves. So understanding what different parts exist, including the parts that were wounded and the parts that oftentimes we end up with protective parts to protect ourselves from the more wounded parts that we exile because it wasn't safe to bring them out. So there's just other ways people go about this, which is pretty beautiful, right? That
Mhm.
there's not one way that we can heal from these wounds. There's different ways, and especially like what's going to work for you, may be different than other people. So finding someone who really kind of you resonate with. I will say, and I don't know if you'd agree, but I think more than just a theory or modality, like doing a certain technique or something, I think having a relationship with a safe, trusted support person, a therapist, is really important.
Yeah.
Especially healing these relational wounds. That's a starting point. You can do techniques and modalities and stuff, but if you don't feel safe with your therapist, that's a problem. So I think building that's a starting point, that relationship.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because a lot of those things that are showing up for you relationally outside the therapist office are going to be replayed inside the office. And now you have someone to actually work through that with in a safe space, um, which is important above all. Granted, yes, having these techniques. Another one I was thinking while you were talking was externalizing the problem,
Oh
which
yeah.
again is very narrative because that's a very shamey thing. If you're like, I'm bad, I'm an addict. So it's like, no, this is, and even if they can name it sometimes, I found people really get into naming the issue because like think of like the worst name, something you can't stand, and they love doing that. But then it makes it more real because then they find themselves talking to that other part outside of them. So it's not something that they're embodying in themselves. But like you said, first and foremost, you got to have that strong foundation where you actually like think your therapist is safe. Because if not, none of these techniques or anything are gonna land or do anything for you.
Your system's going to be protected from even trying to go there if you don't feel safe with that person, because for obvious reasons, because especially if the person, some of your early wounds were relationally, then we got to start there. Safety.
Yeah. Um, do you have any of your favorite books, like trauma books and resources?
Specifically trauma, because I know we've shifted into
Yeah.
that. I'll just say a couple things. I mean, anything, not anything. I do like some Pat Carnes resources for this sex addiction side of things, understanding um, what's underneath it. Like Facing the Shadows, a great
Hmm.
workbook to start with. Understanding more up here, more cognitively, like how these behaviors started and manifest. For trauma, there's a ton. I mean, I mentioned Eddie Caparucci's. If you kind of identify with inner child language, anything from Richard Schwartz around internal family systems, he's more approachable. We mentioned polyvagal theory, which is Stephen Porges. He's really thick and dense to
I
read.
would say
He's
that
the
gets a little
smart
heavy.
man, very smart, but not light reading.
Yeah.
I actually find what Gary Wilson's Your Brain on Porn. So if it's specifically
Hmm.
porn related, it's not trauma, but it's also understanding how porn affects our brain is really, really
Which a
great.
lot of people gravitate to that, especially if you have that kind of thinking where you're more of like a technical kind of person. Then your brain on porn is an excellent one because
Yeah.
they can grasp that.
Yeah. Michael Barda has written Tinsa, which is his first kind of book on the topic that I know of, related to the neurobiology of sex addiction. So
Mhm.
understanding that it's neurobiological in nature. So he's got a new book out too, which is really good too, actually. So that's another resource.
Awesome. My favorite ones for because sometimes. like the sex addiction piece, like maybe they're just not quite ready to go into the sex addiction piece, but they know something is wrong and off. So they're there. So I have to like back up a few steps and just start with just trauma in general to give them some insight. Um, the classic, the body keeps the score, that I feel like is like a staple when everyone's, especially talking about somatic and how it's just in your body. Um, what happened to you, which is another one that I know is gaining a lot of popularity
Hmm.
lately,
Yeah.
and one that I like because the emotional abuse once again is very covert. Adult children of narcissistic parents. I've found that one to be very successful with clients
Yeah.
because they've been in this system the whole time and they had no idea that this is how it's affecting them.
Yeah, made me think too. Peter Levine's Waking the Tiger, also, that's another
Mhm.
somatic book too that could be helpful. I think that's pretty approachable too.
So I think the thing to take away from all this is like there's literally not one way to do this. You have to figure out whatever works for you when we're talking about trying to break down sex addiction and get to your, because once again, the sex addiction is the symptom. The trauma under it looks different for everybody. So how it's treated is going to look different from, person to person. So you, like how you said with EMDR, you don't know, like you can't predict it. So it's like, I guess you just gotta, we're throwing, I always tell my clients, we're throwing darts at the board right now and we're seeing what sticks.
Which is unfortunately, I hope there's a day where we can better pinpoint these things. But even with pharmaceuticals or other approaches, that's kind of how it is. We see how someone responds, and then we adjust based on that. So I wish we had more sophisticated, but but I think we have a lot more resources now than we ever have.
Oh yeah.
When if I have one
Mhm.
caveat, is that okay? Can I say one thing?
Go ahead.
I just have to say this is for the betrayed partners to understand. Like sometimes we hear the addict saying, "Oh, it's my trauma that led to my sex addiction," and
Mm,
almost use that as an excuse. Um, in no way, I want to say there oftentimes is trauma that underlies a sex addiction, and someone's behaviors are still 100% their responsibility to take
yeah.
responsibility for. So nothing caused them to do this. So I just have to say that because I feel like this becomes an excuse sometimes that we hear, and I don't want to leave this saying that just because of someone's past that made them do something.
No, thank you for pointing that out because there is a difference between an excuse and an explanation. And sometimes addicts might treat sex addiction as trauma as an excuse rather it being an explanation. Like, no, this is what fed into that led me to make these, decisions. But it's still, we can still have the same trauma and choose something else. So one
Exactly.
plus one doesn't equal two. It's not causation. So yes, excellent point. Thank you for pointing that out. Well, that's all I got for you today, Dan.
Sounds great.
Thanks again to Dan for joining us. And if you've not done so already, make sure you like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. And as always, remember to embrace your healing journey. Every step forward brings a new hope for tomorrow. See you next time.